The desert did not welcome mercy. It swallowed it. For 40 days, Maria walked its burning sands with the wounded son of the Apache chief, leaning on her shoulder, clinging to life. She had never meant to find him. She had been traveling alone when she discovered him near a ravine, half buried in dust, fever burning through his blood, breath shallow as though the desert itself was stealing it from him. She could have turned away and no one would have blamed her. Instead, something fierce inside her refused to let him die. From that moment on, her life was tied to his survival. She dragged him beneath the shade of jagged rocks, tearing strips from her clothes to bind his wounds, forcing water between his lips when he could barely swallow. By day, the sun scorched them until her skin blistered and his lips cracked. By night, the cold crept into their bones. And she would keep watch with a rough spear she carved from broken wood, listening to the distant howls of wolves and the whisper of shifting sand. Slowly, painfully, he began to heal. At first, he barely spoke, only watching her with mistrust and confusion. Then distrust faded into awe at her stubborn courage. He warned her that if his people found her with him, they would not see a savior. They would see an intruder. She only smirked and told him to live first, worry later. Somewhere in those silent nights and desperate days, respect grew between them, threaded with unspoken gratitude. When at last he could walk, she guided him toward his homeland, believing she was leading both of them to safety. Instead, the moment they reached Apache territory, warriors surrounded them, their faces carved with suspicion and rage. Spears lifted. Voices shouted accusations. Maria stood frozen, confused, exhausted, yet unbowed. She expected relief and thanks. Instead, she saw death staring back at her. And when dawn rose over the desert sands, she heard the chilling verdict whispered through the tribe. Like a wind carrying doom, they would dig her grave. They bound Maria's wrists with braided leather and stood her before the gathered tribe, the desert wind beating against her like another accuser. Faces surrounded her, stern warriors, wary elders, grieving mothers who believed every outsider brought blood and ruin. She could feel the weight of their hatred pressing against her skin. The chief stood tall at the center, his presence strong and commanding, his expression unreadable as storm clouds. Beside him, Tahoma struggled to remain upright, still weak, yet burning with urgency as he pleaded. He told them she was not the enemy, that without her he would be a corpse left for vultures, that she had carried his life across 40 merciless days. But every word seemed to vanish against long histories of betrayal and violence. Tradition whispered louder than truth. They accused her of luring him into danger, of spying for enemies who wanted the tribe broken. The more they spoke, the more Maria realized that this was not just about her. It was about fear carved deep into these people by years of suffering. She did not beg them to listen. She faced them with the same defiance that kept her alive in the desert. In a steady voice, she explained how she found him, how she fought for his life when he could not fight for his own, how she gave everything she had without expecting anything in return. Some eyes softened. Others hardened more. The chief studied her with the heavy scrutiny of a man torn between duty and doubt. Finally, his voice rose over the noise, calm yet carrying judgment like a blade. According to their laws, an outsider who stepped uninvited onto sacred ground deserved death. But honor required truth. The tribe would not kill her immediately. Instead, she would face the judgment of the desert and the spirits, just as their people had for generations when truth needed proving. If she survived the sacred trial, she would live. If not, the sands would claim her and their law would be satisfied. Warriors seized her again, dragging her toward a canyon that whispered of old rites and dangerous silence. Behind her, the tribe began preparations, not in hope, but in grim expectation. Somewhere near the camp, a shallow pit was already being dug. Her grave waited, as though the desert itself were holding its breath. Night wrapped around the canyon like a closing fist, and Maria stood alone beneath a sky full of silent, watching stars, knowing every breath she took might be her last. The tribe had left her with nothing but the clothes on her, back in the memory of the grave, already being dug in the distant camp. Her heart pounded, but fear did not break her. She had survived wolves, fever, thirst, and despair. She would not let the darkness claim her now. The wind howled through the canyon, walls like the voices of unseen, spirits testing her resolve. She gathered dry branches, built a fragile fire, and stayed awake, senses sharpened by the knowledge that danger could come from any direction. Coyotes prowled in the shadows, their eyes glowing with hunger, yet they hesitated as if something greater guarded her. When a sudden sandstorm roared across the desert, she wrapped her arms around herself and stood firm, refusing to bow, letting the storm pass as if accepting its challenge. As dawn approached, the world softened into pale gold light, and the silence felt different, less threatening, more accepting. That was when she heard footsteps. Not enemies, familiar ones. Tahoma appeared first, stumbling but determined, breaking the rules of his own people just to stand with her. Behind him came elders who had secretly watched through the night, wanting to see whether fate would protect or destroy her. When they saw Maria still standing, weary yet unbroken, something changed in their eyes. Strength against the desert meant more to them than any spoken plea. It meant she had been chosen, guided, perhaps even spared by forces beyond human judgment. They led her back toward the tribe, not as a prisoner, but as someone they now had to reconsider. The tribe fell silent when they saw her return alive. The chief stared at her for a long moment, then at the son she had saved, and finally at the grave that waited like a shameful reminder of how close they had come to burying the wrong person. Slowly he bowed his head, speaking words that carried through the camp. She was no enemy, no threat, but a protector blessed by endurance. Where death had waited, honor now stood. Maria had not only survived, she had changed a tribe. The day she returned from the canyon, alive and marked by the desert's silent approval, should have ended everything. But survival was not the end of Maria's battle. It was the beginning of another. Though the chief had spoken words of acceptance, not everyone in the tribe was willing to bow to that decision. Some warriors believed fate had been fooled, that an outsider could never truly be trusted. Rumors drifted through the camp like smoke, bitter and poisonous. Maria felt their stares as she walked, some filled with curiosity, some with grudging respect, others with cold hatred waiting for a moment to strike. She carried herself quietly, not triumphantly. She hadn't survived to prove she was better, only to prove she meant no harm. Tahoma, still healing but stronger each day, stayed close to her side, defiantly shielding her presence with his own. He walked with a different kind of strength now, not just as the chief's son, but as someone who owed his life to a woman outsiders would call an enemy and his people still struggled to accept. He spoke to the tribe again, not in desperate pleading this time, but with firm resolve. He reminded them that living by fear would destroy them faster than any enemy. Maria had already proved her loyalty with blood, with suffering. With 40 days, no warrior had dared to face alone. Yet even as some began to soften, darkness still moved quietly among them. A small group of warriors who saw honor only in tradition gathered under night's cover, whispering plans of reclaiming purity and law. To them, the chief's mercy was weakness. Killing Maria, they believed, would restore strength. They waited for the right moment, blades hidden, intentions masked behind rigid silence. And fate granted them one when Maria went to the edge of camp to fetch water alone, believing at last that she was safe. The desert wind carried unfamiliar footsteps behind her, and before she could turn, hands seized her. No words were spoken, no warnings given. Only the cold truth, even survival was not enough for some hearts hardened by fear. Back in the heart of the tribe, Tahoma sensed something wrong. Panic struck when her absence finally became noticed. The tribe that once dug her grave now faced a new test. Whether they would allow hatred to write their future, or stand for the woman who had already proven she deserved life. The desert had spared her once. Now it was the people who would decide her fate.